Hello, beautiful community. Let's talk about what Trump has said about Navalny, but in a way that's going to go to the heart of something that's really important about the trouble that Western democracies are in. So we'll get to the Trump quote in a moment, but first I want to treat us as children to some extent. And that's a strange thing to say, because if anything is true of our current political predicament, it's that in fact the gap in sophistication and in particular in ethical integrity between the average citizen and their political representative has shrunk. Indeed, we're getting increasingly political representatives who have less integrity than just the average citizen. So that's important, and I'm not treating us as children because we're not smart. I'm treating us as children precisely because what I'm about to say we all know, but we're sometimes inclined to forget it or inclined to face it properly. And waking up to that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding the pathologies of our politicians. So I'm going to say a few things now, then we're going to look at the Trump quote, and then I will probably repeat the same things afterwards, and I'll tell you a very quick little story. It's the first thing I want to say. Liar politicians deceive their citizens. PTPs, post-truth populist politicians, enter into a co-conspiracy with citizens in which both parties agree that truth doesn't matter or doesn't matter much. Deceiving you versus entering a co-conspiracy with you, with some of you, in which both you and your political representative agrees that truth doesn't matter. So we're talking about a social dynamic of liberation through the denial of truth. The truth puts me in chains. Engaging in a co-conspiracy in which I throw it off liberates me. It's a social phenomenon of our age. The second thing I want to say is that liar politicians misrepresent the difference between particular truths and particular lies. Post-truth populist politicians misrepresent the difference between truth and lies in general, undermine the difference between truth and lies in general. So these two things we've put on the table clearly suggest that something is going wrong with the internal coherence of statements that some of our political representatives make, and that this degeneration in internal coherence is not simply imposed upon the citizenry, but the citizenry in part engages in a co-conspiracy with its political representatives to deny the stability of the difference between truth and lies, which wasn't denied, let us say, only 10 years ago in Western politics. And the point is that the internal coherence of statements begins to swim. Let me make a third statement, because something else is going on here, which goes beyond just breaking down internal coherence. What also is breaking down is the connectedness between statements. And it's breaking down in a way that goes together with a bad algorithmification of thought. A porridge of words and concepts here. So let's give an example for the problems with coherence and for the problems with connectedness. You know very well the problems of coherence from Russian propaganda. We're seeing this a lot with the messaging about Alexei Navalny. NATO did it, the West did it, Father Christmas did it, the planet Jupiter did it, Saturn did it, but its rings are innocent. Just a mess that's designed to pollute the informational environment with an arrangement of ill-assorted messages that are going to generate confusion and apathy. an example on European soil of a post-truth populist is the ex-UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In fact, that's well illustrated by his recent support for Donald Trump, which doesn't sit together with his support for Ukraine. From spring 2020 onwards, Boris Johnson, as the British Prime Minister, had a messaging, this is the example I'm going to give, it could be many, many other examples, had a messaging about masking that took a post-truth populist frame. I'm going to exaggerate it, but it's going to be reflective of the general politics that occurred. Our regulations say, do it. But not everyone likes it. Mr. Prime Minister, do it or not? Our regulations say do it, but I didn't. So, Mr. Prime Minister, do we do it or do we not? Our regulations are very, very important. But sometimes I just don't feel like doing it on that occasion. I was very, very happy not to do it. But our regulations say do it. So we've not got a situation where a position is being picked in public that is different to a private position. A kind of deception occurs. What we've got is one thing on Monday, another thing on Tuesday, one thing on Wednesday morning, another thing, its opposite thing on Wednesday evening. With this particular politician, Boris Johnson, this was manipulative. In other words, Johnson would have a private view about this of some kind, and it'd be roughly stable. With a politician like Donald Trump, for reasons I'll discuss on a separate occasion, it's a little bit more organic because Trump has very few beliefs. He tends to have dispositional states. A belief has to have a modicum of stability. Yes, you can change your mind, but if I ask you, do you believe this? And you give me 4 different answers, depending on whether I ask you in January, February, or March, or April, that's not a belief. That is too fluid. That is a shifting dispositional state. For many of the places in his head in which Trump should have beliefs sitting around, he just has dispositional states that float about. And actually that makes it easier for him to produce post-truth populist statements. Well, that's a little bit on the incoherence. What about the business of statements not being connected? Well, statements not being connected is something else, but it's also actually a part of post-truth discourse. It's not a matter of internal coherence. It's rather a matter of putting 2 things alongside each other and pretending that they somehow fit together, even though they don't. So, for example, I'm looking at the moon. It's big today. Susan and Harry are being very unfair to me. So it's the length of that jump and the degree to which that jump is algorithmic. That's to say that there could be something in what I've said about the moon, some signals or some trigger words that then lead me to jump onto this other subject. You've come across this very well in all kinds of war discourse and indeed in discourse in your local democracies, where certain combinations of words, rather than the meanings of these words, right, lead to something that is then said in response quite algorithmically. So an example could be somebody has expressed a positive sentiment about Alexei Navalny, therefore they're a Russian imperialist. And so it's not that I believe Navalny is a Russian imperialist and you can't say anything positive about him because you're going to be a vindicator of Russian imperialism yourself too. That's not how the logic works. The logic is algorithmic. That's to say, is there a mention of Navalny? Boom, I've got to do a mention of Russian imperialism. So, talking about strange jumps between statements and a strong algorithmic component to how that jump is made. Let's look at the Trump quote now together. The sudden death of Alexei Navalny has made me more aware of what is happening in our country. It is a slow, steady progression with crooked, radical left politicians, prosecutors, judges leading us down a path to destruction. Now, Trump has been hit for all the things that you'd predict he'd be hit on for this, but not for the main thing we should bring out here. And you can already feel what it might be. It's that disconnected jump. He's been hit for not linking Putin to the death of Navalny. He's been hit for making it all about himself. He's been hit for comparing the persecution of Navalny with his own legal problems. And I won't say anything today about how constructive or unconstructive I think the pursuit of Trump by legal rather than political means is. But let's look at this jump. The sudden death of Navalny, which is Navalny's died. Nobody knows what happened. Some people are going to say this, others are going to say that. The sudden death of Navalny, one block. The next block is America very bad, me treated very badly. America very bad, me treated very badly. That is quite a big jump. And without the normalization of that jump, right, via co-conspiracy you enter with citizens who support you, it's going to look really bizarre. Now, here we do not have, if you like, the primary ingredient of post-truth populist discourse, which is incoherence, right? To X on a Wednesday and to not X on a Wednesday evening. You know, contradictory statements. You don't have that here. But you have this absence, contrived absence of connectedness, and then the algorithmification of response. The algorithmification in this instance might work like this. Any mention of any political system, US system, crooked, Trump treated very unfairly. This is the algorithmic effect. You know, I went paragliding in Vietnam yesterday. I thought it was really nice and the whole experience was nicely organized. Nicely organized could then be the algorithmic trigger word to then start talking about US political system, bad, Trump treated badly. You see, that is an algorithmification of response without which you couldn't make the connection between paragliding in Vietnam and I'm being treated very badly, they're not letting me run, they're making stuff up about me, poor me. So this is really important. So what we've put on the table is liar politicians deceive you, post-truth politicians enter into a co-conspiracy with some of the citizenry that lets go of the difference between lies and truth, so internal coherence. Second thing we said is liar politicians misrepresent particular truths. Post-truth politicians misrepresent the difference between lies and truth in general. Another way to bring out the problem with internal coherence. And then we added another element, which is not internal coherence, but this bizarre disconnectedness mediated by algorithmification. And it's very, very dangerous because, of course, it obstructs thought. And much of the debates that occur in our cultures are now occurring via this algorithmic mode. And it's a real problem. Let me now tell you a story. But I mean, before the story, the basic lesson is too many people go around calling politicians liars who are post-truth populists. And this episode should be there to help us bring out the difference. So many of my academic colleagues, for example, say Boris Johnson is a liar. He has lied Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 7 times a day. Well, I don't see that Boris is a liar. Yeah? I think he's a post-truth populist for the reasons we discussed. Let me tell you a little story. Because if you asked me where some of this comes from, then we're going to go into a conversation about the crisis of trust in the West. That is a product of, in part, the shape of the internet, in part, in fact, centrally in part, for reasons of various forces that are untethering our societies, untethering communal links, intergenerational links, family links, pulling our societies, the fabrics of our societies apart, not because of some kind of moral decline, but because of social forces and economic forces that operate in our society. There is then, of course, the presence of various kinds of economic exclusion. And then there is the presence of various kinds of psychosocial ideologies that are driven by various, often hyperactive conceptions or distortions of the value of authenticity that also mitigate against values of solidarity and the public good, which are prerequisites for the continued functioning of democracy. That's the crisis of trust. In terms of the particular story of post-truth discourse in the West, one of the highlights is the Iraq War and the justifications for the Iraq War. What is historically distinctive about some of the justifications for the Iraq War is that they were a really interesting early bump on that graph that really began to peak much later in the 2010s, of politicians not lying but doing post-truth. So let me tell you a little story. I have an effective relationship with politics. That's to say that expressive kinds of politics do not interest me much and don't drive me much emotionally. If somebody says, well, that regime is very bad, stop buying, I don't know, produce that comes from there, I'll say, if I stop buying that produce, will it generate change? Then I'll stop buying it. But if there is no connection whatever, then I'm not sure how persuaded I'll be to just stop buying it for aesthetic reasons. So I'm generally very effectively minded when it comes to politics, but I recognize the importance of expressive politics too. Obviously, when I was young, I engaged in political enterprises that were expressive, partly to engage in them, but partly to observe them. They weren't ever entirely expressive enterprises. They always had an effective element, but it's debatable how significant that was. And I want to give you an example of this that brings something out about post-truth populism. About 22 years ago, when I was a student at a university in the UK, I did a little bit of participation, a little bit of organizing for the Stop the War coalition, because I was opposed to Iraq war for many reasons. One of them was that I did not see how the overthrowing of the regime could fail to lead to the collapse of the Iraqi state. And certainly all of the Fukuyamian triteness about how that enterprise might go was visible to me before the event, as it was to many people. So I had a meeting with a minister, and I think there were 3 people present in that meeting, a cabinet minister in the UK. And we had perhaps a 40-minute or an hour-long conversation about the government's justifications for the war a few months before it started. And at one point, the minister said that and this is actually somebody who was very formidable politician, very nice, and wasn't inherently a post-truth politician at all, but something of that kind came out in this conversation. And that politician said, you know, we need to stop Iraq from developing weapons of mass destruction. 20 minutes later, in the same conversation, the politician told me, we need to stop Iraq using weapons of mass destruction that it already has. And I said, you've told me two things. You've said that Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction and shouldn't be allowed to develop them. And you've told me that it already has them and it shouldn't be allowed to use them. Which of the two is it? And the minister's response was that distinction, once you begin thinking about it, isn't so sharp, and that there's a way to sticky tape the two things he said that were 20 minutes apart. And then voices were raised, and then we continued the conversation. I felt that was a post-truth answer. I felt that we were dealing with a decision that had already been made, and now being supported by justifications that, when deceptive, that went offering specific kinds of deceits or denials of facts, but that were compromising the coherence between propositions. I felt that I was hearing not a particular misrepresentation, but an inkling of a dissolution of the difference between what is misrepresentation and what isn't. I felt this was a post-truth rather than a deceptive answer, even though as a whole, I didn't feel I was dealing with a post-truth politician. But that very fact, I felt I was dealing with a decent and formidable politician, in fact, is an indication of how post-truth rhetoric popped on the graph around 2002 in Western politics in a way that is rather minor compared to the form we've got now. But if we're talking about the genealogy, or the history really of that rhetoric, then one of the first spots to look for its manifestation is around the time of public discourse in Western countries around the beginning of the Iraq War. That's not what caused the discourse. Make no mistake, because here we're going to move back to the factors about the dissolution of trust. And if we were to date those, we wouldn't date them to 2002. We'd probably date them to the early 70s indeed. But in terms of interesting moments on that graph, that is one interesting moment that didn't cause, but certainly contributed to and accelerated our devolution into post-truth discourse. Beautiful community, do not call post-truth populist politicians liars. They're doing something entirely different and entirely more politically and democratically corrosive. Lots of love. Bye-bye.